Most people think that this story is about politics. It's not. It's actually about strategy. Today, we'll examine the military realities, the geopolitical calculations, and the economic consequences that could shape what happens next. For months, the world watched the US and Iran move closer and closer towards a confrontation that many feared would spiral into much a larger regional war. The assumption was simple. America had overwhelming military power, but Iran had missiles, drones, and geography. Eventually, one side would have to back down. But this week, something unexpected happened. The language changed. The battlefield conversation shifted. The focus moved away from new strikes and towards diplomacy. Suddenly, instead of asking, how much damage can the US inflict on Iran? The question now is, can Washington and Tehran find a way out before the economic and military costs become too high? And that question reveals something important about modern conflict. Wars are not decided only by who has the most advanced weapons. They are decided by who can sustain pressure longer, by who can absorb costs more, and by who can turn geography, economics, and diplomacy into strategic leverage. Because the center of this crisis is not just Tehran, it's the Strait of Hormuz. And the battle for this strait has created a strategic dilemma for both sides. The US is the world's most powerful military, but Iran does not need to defeat America militarily. Iran only needs to make the cost of achieving the US's objectives too high. So in this video, we're going to break down the real story behind this crisis and where it goes next. Why America's military options have become more complicated. Why Iran still has significant leverage despite suffering enormous damage. Why Oman, Qatar and Pakistan have become central players. And finally, why the biggest consequence of this conflict is not on the battlefield, but in global energy markets. Because the next phase of this crisis is not decided by missiles and drones, but will be decided by economics. Let's first explore the war behind the war, the logistics problem. To understand why diplomacy suddenly has become more important, we have to understand a reality that's often ignored in modern conflicts. Military power is not just about weapons. It's about supply chains. A country can have the most advanced aircraft in the world, but if it cannot replace the missiles under those aircraft which fires it, its options become increasingly limited. This is the hidden war behind the headlines, the war of industrial capacity. During this conflict, the US relied heavily on some of its most advanced and expensive systems: cruise missiles, ballistic missile interceptors, air defense systems, precision strike weapons. These weapons are incredibly effective, but they're also difficult and slow to replace. A missile is not something that you can simply produce overnight, or something you can order on Amazon. Behind every interceptor is specialized manufacturing, complex electronics, rare earth materials, highly skilled workers, and years of supply chain investment. This creates a strategic problem. The US may have the ability to strike targets, but every strike creates a question. How quickly can those weapons be replaced? This is why military planners increasingly focus on sustainability. The key question is not, can we hit the target? The key question is, can we continue hitting targets for months while maintaining readiness elsewhere? And this matters because the US is not dealing with one strategic challenge. The US is balancing commitments across multiple regions: the Europe facing off Russia, the Indo-Pacific versus China, and the Middle East. Each theater competes with the same limited resources. This is the fundamental difference between a short-term military operation and a prolonged conflict. The first phase is about capability. The second phase is about endurance. And endurance is where the calculations become much more complicated. Because Iran understands this. Tehran does not have to match America's military power system for system. It only has to create enough uncertainty and cost that Washington begins questioning whether escalation achieves its political objectives. This is the logic of asymmetric warfare. The weaker military power does not necessarily try to win. It tries to prevent the stronger power from achieving a decisive victory. And that brings us to the central question. If Iran cannot defeat the US conventionally, what leverage does Tehran actually have? That answer is geography, and the most strategically important waterway on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz. This strait is, at its narrowest, only about 40 kilometers wide, but through this passage flows a significant share of global energy trade: oil, natural gas, LNG, petrochemical products. For decades, the assumption in the US has been that if Hormuz was ever threatened, American military power would restore freedom of navigation. Bear in mind, the US Fifth Fleet is stationed in Bahrain nearby. The United States Navy has unmatched global reach. Its aircraft carriers, submarines, intelligence networks, and regional partnerships give it enormous military advantages. But the current crisis has exposed a more complicated reality. The question is not whether the US can physically strike Iran. It definitely can. The question is whether it can reopen the Hormuz quickly, safely, without triggering a much larger regional conflict. And this is where Iran's strategy has become very clear. Tehran does not need to control the world's oceans. It does not even need to control the Persian Gulf. It does not need to defeat the US Navy. It only needs enough uncertainty that commercial operators, insurers, and energy companies decide the risk is too high. Because in modern economies, perception can be almost as powerful as physical control. A tanker does not need to be sunk for energy markets to react. Insurance premiums rise, shipping companies delay voyages, traders price risk, and suddenly a regional security crisis becomes a global economic issue. This is the power of asymmetric leverage, and Iran understands this. So what is the ultimate Iranian calculation? Iran's military strategy has always been about a simple reality. It cannot compete with the US. The US spends vastly more on defense. So Tehran has invested in capabilities designed not to defeat the US directly, but to raise the cost of intervention. These include ballistic missiles, drones, coastal defense systems, naval capabilities, cyber operations, and regional partner networks, militias, proxies. The objective is not necessarily victory on the battlefield. The objective is deterrence. The message is, if you can impose damage on us, we can impose enough costs on you and the global economy that continuing becomes politically difficult. This is why Iran's strategy matters so much. Geography has given Iran a form of leverage that military spending alone cannot easily remove. But bear in mind that Iran is not invulnerable. It is important to understand this side of the equation. Its economy has been under decades of sanctions. Its energy infrastructure is exposed. Its conventional military capabilities remain far behind those of the US and its neighbors in the wealthy Gulf states. Any prolonged conflict would impose enormous costs on Tehran. Iran's strategy is therefore not based on defeating America. It is based on preventing the US from achieving a decisive political outcome. History has repeatedly shown that military superiority does not automatically translate into political success. Now, let's move to the Straits of Hormuz. This creates the central dilemma. The US's objective is straightforward. Restore freedom of navigation, prevent energy disruption, avoid a regional war. Iran's objective is different though. It wants to maintain enough pressure to force negotiations on terms favourable to Tehran. Both sides have different definitions of success. For the US, success means ships move freely without political concessions. For Tehran, success means using its geographic position to secure economic and strategic benefits. The challenge is finding an arrangement where neither side feels it has surrendered. And that is why countries like Oman and Qatar have become so important, because when two adversaries cannot directly agree, they often need intermediaries who can communicate without public pressure. And while diplomacy moves quietly behind closed doors, another battle is already unfolding. Not in the Gulf, not in military bases, but in energy markets around the world. Because the next major shock from this crisis may not come from a missile, it comes from the price of energy. So this is the real battlefield. When people think about the Iran crisis, they naturally focus on missiles, aircraft, political leaders, but the biggest consequence we've seen is the energy prices skyrocketing. Because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a strategic waterway, it is one of those arteries of the global economy. A disruption there affects far more than countries in the Middle East. It affects Europe, Asia, global inflation, industrial production, the cost of energy for households across the world. The Persian Gulf is home to one of the world's largest oil and gas exporters. Together, they represent a critical component of global energy supply. This is why geopolitical events often create economic consequences far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Let's just explore the LNG dimension, why Europe and Asia are watching closely. Liquefied natural gas has become a cornerstone of global energy security. Europe, particularly after reducing its dependence on Russian pipeline gas, has become much more reliant on flexible LNG supplies. Asia is also heavily dependent on LNG imports. Northeast Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, China, and in Southern Asia like India rely on stable global energy flows to support their economies. This is why Qatar has become strategically important. A significant portion of global LNG is connected to the Gulf maritime routes. Europe in particular is sensitive because it has experienced multiple energy shocks in recent years. First was the disruption of Russian pipeline flows in 2022. Then the global energy competition following this conflict. Then extreme weather events affecting energy demand and supply. The Iran crisis introduces yet another potential source of uncertainty. Europe's challenge is not simply finding gas. It is ensuring that gas remains affordable and reliable during periods of stress. Because energy is not just a commodity. It is the foundation of manufacturing, chemicals, fertilizer production, and household affordability. A sustained disruption around the Strait of Hormuz would therefore not only be an energy story, it could become an inflation story. And the timing of this crisis is particularly important because global trade is already under pressure. Around the world, several critical transport routes are experiencing disruption or increased uncertainty. The Red Sea, the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal. European waterways have experienced periods of reduced capacity due to very hot weather conditions. At the same time, geopolitical competition is increasing the cost and complexity of global trade. In recent years, this has demonstrated that resilience matters just as much as efficiency. Companies and governments are now asking the question, what happens if the system breaks? This is why the Iran crisis matters even more to people thousands of kilometers away from the Middle East. The outcome will influence oil prices, LNG prices, inflation expectations, and central bank decisions. The battlefield may physically be in the Persian Gulf, but the economic impact is being felt across the world. And this creates another constraint for Washington. A military escalation may achieve tactical objectives, but if it triggers a major energy shock, the political consequences could be much broader. which brings us to the final question. If neither side can achieve everything at once, what does the end game look like? Where do we go next? At this point, the crisis appears to be moving towards a strategic crossroad. There are three possible paths. So path one is a diplomatic compromise. The first possibility is a negotiated arrangement. Neither side gets everything at once. The US would likely seek restored shipping confidence, reduced risk of escalation, protection of regional partners. Iran would seek economic relief, recognition of its security concerns, and political benefits. The challenge is that compromise requires both sides to convince their domestic audiences they achieved something. Scenario 2 is a frozen conflict. This is a prolonged stalemate. No full peace, no full war, periodic incidents, continued sanctions, continued military pressure. This type of outcome has happened repeatedly in the Middle East. A crisis can stop escalating without actually being resolved. Scenario 3 is another escalation cycle. This is renewed confrontation, a single miscalculation, an attack on a vessel, a strike that caused mass casualties, or regional escalation, which could rapidly change the situation. This is why crisis management becomes so important, because when two sides believe they have leverage, the danger is that each side underestimates the other's willingness to absorb costs. So to conclude, the most important lesson from this crisis is that modern conflicts are rarely decided by military power alone. They are decided by a combination of military capacity, economic endurance, geography, industrial capability, and diplomacy. The US remains the world's most powerful military force. Iran remains under enormous pressure, but both sides face constraints. Washington cannot ignore the economic consequences of escalation. Tehran cannot ignore the cost of prolonged confrontation. And sitting at the center of the strategic competition is a narrow waterway that connects the Middle East to the global economy. The question now is not simply who can win. The bigger question is who can find a way out before the costs become too high. Because in this crisis, the next decisive move may not come from a missile launch. It may come from a negotiating table or an energy market reacting to a world that has become far less predictable. If you find this analysis useful, subscribe for deep dives into geopolitics, energy markets, and strategic forces shaping the world. Let me know in the comments what you think. Thanks for watching.